Hello and welcome to the 2020 to 2021 First Tech Challenge Season Kickoff for Ultimate Goal presented by Qualcomm. My name's Alex Lambert and I'm the Ohio Lead FTA. I'll be walking you through some of the details of the inspection process. The inspection rules are located in Game Manual Part 1, which can be found on the firstinspires.org website under the FTC Game and Season Materials section. This year, the game manual is split into two sections, one for traditional events and one for remote events. However, most of the inspection rules are the same, so we'll just go through one of these and then talk about the differences. The inspection rules start in Section 7, the robot, so we'll jump there. One of the big first sections here is the robot technology definitions. It's important that everybody is on the same page in terms of terminology and definitions. Make sure you read through all of these, especially if you're a newer team, because some of them can be unfamiliar. Scrolling down to the robot rules section in 7.3, we have four major sections: the robot general rules, the robot mechanical rules, the robot electronic rules, and the robot software rules. At the start of the robot rules section, it has a couple links to some useful references. In addition to the rules contained within this document, it's important to check the official Q&A game forum, where users may ask questions about rules present or not present, and the rulings made in the Q&A forum are official and supersede the rules that may appear in the game manual. It's also important to check the legal and illegal parts list, which goes into more detail than the game manual does. Starting off with RG01, illegal parts. Some general types of mechanisms that are not allowed are those that could damage the playing field, other robots, could cause a safety hazard, or could cause a delay of the game. Most of these are common sense. However, there are some specific types of devices that are explicitly forbidden. For example, those designed to ground the robot to the playing field, closed gas devices, hydraulic devices, and vacuum-based mechanisms. RG02 describes the robot's maximum starting size. FTC robots must start in an 18-inch cube. However, they can expand to any size after the match begins. In order to fit within this 18-inch cube restriction, the robot may use either mechanical means in a power-off condition, or they can be powered on and use a pre-positioning technique via servos and motors. If your robot uses motors and servos to initialize, ensure that you include the following sticker on your robot. Robot moves on initialization. The robot controller, which is the brains of your robot mounted in the robot itself, must be mounted according to the standards of RG03. It's recommended that it's mounted to be accessible and visible by field personnel and, of course, yourselves. It should be mounted so that the display screen, if you're using an Android device, is protected from contact with the playing field or other robots. The last thing you need is a robot punching a hole through your screen with an attachment. Also make sure that when you mount the robot controller, you keep in mind that it is in fact a wireless device and you don't obscure it with too much metal and bury it deep in the robot. It may make it difficult to control during match play. RG04 describes the team number display. All teams must have their team number displayed prominently on the robot on opposite sides of the robot, two opposite sides. It must be easily identifiable and it must have a certain stroke width and height. Make sure that whatever your team number display is put on is robust enough to withstand rigors of match play. So probably don't just print out a piece of paper and scrawl on it with a Sharpie unless you're putting some additional protection over it. Similarly, RG05 describes the alliance marker. Robots must include a team-supplied alliance marker, also on two opposite sides of the robot, in order to identify the alliance. It must be on the same side as the team number and within 3 inches of the number. It must be visible to referees during the match. The alliance marker is either a red solid square or a blue solid circle, roughly in the 2.5-inch dimensions. Both alliance markers must be removable so you can swap them between matches, and like your team number, they should be robust enough to withstand the rigors of match play. Collisions, bumps, stabbings, more collisions, you get the idea. RG06 describes the allowed energy sources that can be used to power your robots and generally move them around the field. The obvious one is electrical energy, which is drawn from approved batteries. Again, see the legal and illegal parts list. Additionally, your robot can use energy from a change in position of center of gravity, i.e., you're allowed to move your robot by rolling it down a ramp without power. You can also move your robot via storage achieved by deformation of robot parts. That's fancy speak for springs. Robot parts may not be launched from the robot, even if you are still attached, i.e. via a tether or cable. RG08, however, describes the rules within you are allowed to launch game elements. You must launch the elements just enough to score, and they cannot travel further than 16 feet horizontally in the air or more than 5 feet vertically in elevation. So be careful when tuning your launchers. Moving on, Section 732 describes the robot mechanical parts and material rules. Allowed materials are very varied, and you can use a whole bunch of materials ranging from woods, plastics, metals, sheets, extruded shapes, magnets, rubber, and you can also use a variety of post-process materials such as perforated sheet, diamond plate, injection molded parts, 3D printed parts. These are particularly popular with many teams, as well as cables, strings, ropes, surgical tubings, and of course springs. You're also allowed to use commercial off-the-shelf parts as described in RM02. Commercial off-the-shelf parts are, as they describe, things that you just buy commercially produced off the shelf. It's important that you observe the limitations here, namely that they can only have a single degree of freedom. That means that it either moves in a single dimension linearly or in a single axis rotationally. Some examples include linear slides, linear actuators, lazy Susans, pulleys, single-speed gearboxes, lead screws. An example of an illegal multiple degree of freedom part is, for example, a gripper attachment because it can move, for example, forwards and backwards as well as left to right. RM03 describes the rules around modifying your materials and commercial off-the-shelf parts. You can modify them pretty much in any method you can think of, cutting, drilling, painting, so long as none of the other rules are violated. Feel free to reach out to people with fancy equipment and machining equipment in order to do the necessary modifications. RM04 describes the allowed methods for assembling a robot. Pretty much everything's on the playing field here. Welding, brazing, soldering, fasteners, screws, nuts, bolts, rivets. All kinds of materials and methods are available for assembling your robot. RM05 describes lubricants. Any commercial off-the-shelf lubricant is allowed so long as it does not contaminate the playing field, scoring elements, or other robots. For example, you don't want to lubricate your wheel axles so much that it's dripping down your wheels and getting all over the field. That's just gross. Section 7.3.3 describes the robot electrical parts and materials. There are many, many ways to build and wire your robot, some better than others. The rules described in this section tell you what is and is not allowed. There's also an additional resource teams can reference known as the Robot Wiring Guide, which is linked in this section. RE01 describes rules around your main power switch. All robots must be controlled with all power provided from the battery pack through a main power switch. There are a few specific parts that you are allowed to use for these purposes. The robot main power switch must be mounted in a position to be readily accessible and visible to field personnel. A label, as described here, must be placed near the main power switch of the robot to help it be visible. Make sure that it meets the size specifications shown here, so don't shrink it and get onto a tiny shrunken version. RE02 describes rules for the battery mount. Batteries must be securely attached, for example with Velcro, zip ties, or rubber bands, on the robot in a location where they will not make direct contact. You don't want somebody to be stabbing your battery because not only could it break it, but it could also present a safety hazard. I will say from personal experience, I have seen teams drop their batteries on the field and it is not pretty. If it comes out, then you're kind of out of luck. RE03 describes the robot main battery. Robots must be powered by exactly one 12-volt battery. there are a few different options which are available to teams listed here. Note, there may be similar looking batteries available from other sources, but make sure you're buying an actual legitimate legal battery. RE04 describes the fuses. Now, you may or may not be aware, but fuses are intended to limit the amount of current that passes through a certain junction. As a result, you are not allowed to modify your fuses from the original manufacturer specifications. For example, removing them, shorting them, or putting a higher capacity fuse in. Your inspector may ask you about this during inspections. And if suspicious behavior is observed during the field, a referee may ask you about it as well. If necessary, a fuse can be replaced with a smaller rating, i.e. less current. However, the replaceable fuses must be single use. No self-resetting fuses. RE05 describes the sources for robot power. Most devices on your robot are going to be powered via the power ports on the Rev Expansion Hub or Rev Control Hub, except for the following. The expansion and control hubs themselves are powered by the robot main battery. Don't forget about the power switch, though. The RevSpark mini motor controllers, if used, are also powered by the robot main battery. Allowed sensors are connected directly to the Rev Expansion Hub or Rev Control Hub for their power. Light sources can be connected as described in the rules in RE12. Video cameras for the rules in RE13. If a robot controller uses an Android device instead of the Rev Control Hub, the Android device must be powered by its own internal battery or by the built-in charging feature of the Rev Expansion Hub. Other external power is not allowed. For the robot controller, exactly one is required. You can use additional optional Rev Expansion Hubs. You are not allowed to use both an Android device and a Rev Control Hub. RE07 describes the Android devices that are allowed. You'll notice that all of them are Motorola Motos. Previous years included devices such as the ZTE Speed, Samsung Galaxy devices, and some Google Nexus devices. These have been removed from the list of valid devices, so be sure to check out which devices you have and make sure it's still legal. When using Android devices, no other Android devices may be used for robot controllers or driver stations. See Software Rule RS03 for the approved list of operating system versions. We'll get to that in a minute. Your Android robot controller, can only connect to a Rev Expansion Hub or a USB hub. Control module quantities in RE08. Your control modules must consist of the following: a Rev Control Hub or an allowed Android device connected to a Rev Expansion Hub. In addition to the above, you can have no more than one additional Rev Expansion Hub, so a maximum of 2, if using an Android device, and a maximum of 1 when using a control hub. Any quantity of RevSpark mini motor controllers and any quantity of Rev Servo power modules. RE09 describes the valid motor and servo controllers. Previous years allowed modern robotics modules. These have been removed this year. The only allowed motor and servo controllers are the Rev Expansion Hub, Rev Control Hub, Rev Servo Power Module, RevSpark Mini Motor Controller, and the VEX Motor Controller 29. DC motor rules remain similar to previous years. A maximum of 8 DC motors are allowed in any combination, and listed are the different types of motors you can use. No other motors aside from the ones in this list are allowed. RE11 describes servo limits. A maximum of 12 servos are allowed on the robot. Any servo which is compatible with the attached servo controller is allowed, so no specific lists of servos. The servos may only be controlled and powered by a Rev Expansion Hub, Control Hub, or Rev Servo Power Module. You can use linear or rotary, but they're limited in voltage to 6 volts or less and must have a 3-wire servo connector. Note that the VEX EDR393 motor is considered a servo. It must be used in conjunction with its VEX Motor Controller 29 and a Rev Servo Power Module. Maximum of 2 of these per servo module are allowed. RE12 describes the sensors available to your robot. Sensors are subject to these constraints. Compatible from any manufacturer that can be connected to the hub, compatible from any manufacturer that can be connected to the logic level converter or the I2C sensor adapter cable, see RE14.K for details, and passive electronics may be used as recommended. Voltage sensors are allowed, but not on motors or servo controllers. Current sensors are similarly allowed, except on motors or servo controllers. I2C multiplexers are allowed. They can only be connected to and powered from the connections available on the rev expansion or control hubs. And lastly, voltage and or current sensors are allowed to connect between your battery pack and your rev expansion hub or control hub. Now you might be wondering, if I'm not allowed to put them on the motor and servo controllers, why would I want to bother with a voltage or current sensor? Well, the answer is that it can be very useful in diagnosing your robot performance and identifying where you may be limited in performance by the available voltage and current on your battery. Rule RE13 describes the light sources available. You are allowed to use functional and decorative light sources, including LEDs. However, you're not allowed to use focused or directed light sources, so no laser pointers, no mirrors, focusing or directing, except for those included within the Rev Robotics 2-meter distance sensor. Light source control by compatible ports on the Rev Hub is allowed. You can also use some commercial off-the-shelf interface modules that do not contain user-programmable microprocessors between the light source and the components. Your only approved power sources for lights are internal, as supplied by the commercial off-the-shelf manufacturer battery pack or battery holder, and the Rev expansion hub and Rev motor control ports. Please note, if you're going to be using lights, ensure that they follow the highlighted flash rate of change here to avoid triggering seizures in any nearby personnel or audience members. You are allowed to use LED lights to signal events to yourself, provided that the flash is slow enough to fit this criteria. Rule RE14 describes what video cameras are available to be used on the robot. Self-contained recording devices such as GoPros are allowed, however, they are only allowed for non-functional post-match viewing and cannot be used for real-time display. Approved video cameras must be powered by internal batteries. For your vision sensing needs, UVC compatible cameras are allowed. It's recommended that they are connected directly to the control hub or through a powered USB hub that is in turn connected to an Android device robot controller through an OTG adapter. Rule RE15 describes the robot wiring rules. Robot wiring must use all of the following. So you can use USB surge protectors connected to your USB cables. You're allowed to insert ferrite chokes or ferrite beads on wires and cables. This is a good idea. You're allowed to use mini USB to OTG micro cables and any combinations of mini USBs, USB hubs, and OTG adapters in order to connect your robot controller Android device to the robot electronics. You're allowed to use Anderson power poles or similar crimp and quick connect style connectors, and these are recommended for joining your electrical wires. Installed connectors such as battery pack connectors and battery charger connectors, although they may be replaced with the Anderson power poles or any compatible connectors. Power and motor control wires must use a consistent color coding with different colors for positive and negative. Be sure to use the same convention across your robot when possible. Wire and cable management products of any type are allowed, such as cable ties, clips, and sleeving. Wire insulation materials of any type are permitted when used to insulate electrical wires or secure motor control wires to motors. Note that wire insulation materials are not allowed for other applications, except when allowed in the legal and legal parts applications. The power, motor control, servo encoders, and sensor wires and their connectors may be extended, modified, custom-made, or repurchased as commercial off-the-shelf, subject to the following constraints. Direct power wires must be gauge 18 or larger AWG. Motor control wires must be 22 AWG or larger for the Tetrix 12-volt motors and Rev Robotics Core Hex 12-volt motors, and 18 AWG or larger for all other 12-volt DC motors. PWM servo wires must be 22 AWG gauge or larger. Sensor wires should be the same size or larger than the original wiring. Please be prepared during robot inspection to show documentation confirming the wire gauges used. It's important to make sure that you don't use too thin of wires for the power passing through them, as this could pose an electrical or fire hazard. You are also allowed to use logic level converters to convert from the 5 volts to 3 volts or I2C sensors. Exactly one logic level converter per I2C device or digital sensor is allowed. It should only draw power from the Rev expansion hub and Rev control hub. Electrically grounding the control system electronics to the frame of the robot is allowed and only permitted using a first approved commercially manufactured resistive grounding strap. There is only one such strap approved for use, and it's the Rev Robotics grounding strap. Teams that have electronics with power pole connectors may also use their power pole to XT30 adapter in conjunction with the resistive grounding strap. No other grounding straps or adapters are permitted. For additional details, please see the Robot Wiring Guide, linked in this section. Rule RE16 describes how you may modify your electronics. Approved electrical and electronic devices may be modified to make them more useful. However, they may not be modified internally or in any way that affects safety. Some examples of such modifications include shortening and extending wires, replacing or adding connectors, shortening motor shafts, replacing gearboxes, or changing gears. Modifications that are not allowed include replacing the H-bridge on a motor controller, rewinding your motor, replacing fuses with higher values than specified by the manufacturer, shorting fuses, or changing internal servo components to convert a limited rotation servo to a continuous rotation servo, or vice versa. Rule RE17 describes the constraints on the driver station. Teams must provide their own driver station, and it must comply with the following rules. It must consist of an Android device, an OTG cable, no more than one USB hub, no more than one commercial off-the-shelf USB external battery, optional, no more than 2 gamepads, and any components used to hold the above listed devices. The driver station Android device USB interface may connect to either a mini USB to OTG cable or combination of cables connected to a USB hub, or one gamepad USB cable and an OTG adapter. Essentially, you can connect directly to the controller via an OTG adapter, or you can connect to a hub which goes to the controllers. You are allowed to use a commercial off-the-shelf USB battery connected to the USB hub in order to charge your driver station Android device, which you may consider using if you find yourself running out of batteries. There is some additional gamepads that are allowed this year, and they are listed below here. You have the classic Logitech F310 gamepad, the Xbox 360 controller, and now we have the Sony DualShock 4 wireless controller for PlayStation 4, as well as the ET Park wired controller for PlayStation 4. Please note that if using the wireless controller, it must be operating in wired mode. Also note that when building any contraptions to contain your driver station, that the driver station is also a wireless device with a wireless radio, so be sure not to encase it in metal or otherwise use metal or radio signal blocking materials between it and your robot controller. Rule RE18 describes additional electronics, or rather those that you are not allowed to use. Those not addressed in preceding rules are not allowed. This includes devices such as Arduino boards, Raspberry Pis, relays, and custom circuits. Section 7.3.4 describes the robot software rules. This is the software that's loaded onto your robot controller and driver station, i.e. the FTC official apps. RS01 describes the device names that your robot controller and driver station must use. This is the format of your team number, followed by a hyphen, followed by either RC for robot controller or DS for driver station. If your team uses more than one set of phones, you are allowed to insert the letters A, B, C, D, etc. in between the number and the RC or DS designation in order to indicate a matching pair. RS02 describes the recommended programming tools. There are several programming tools available for teams, including the FTC Blocks Development Tool, which is a visual block-based graphical programming tool which is hosted from the robot controller and can be accessed on a laptop connected to it via Wi-Fi Direct. the FTC OnBot Java programming tool, which is similarly hosted on the robot controller but is text-based Java programming environment. Android Studio, which is a full text-based integration development environment for Java and other languages, as well as the Java Native Interface, or JNI, and Android Native Development Kit, or NDK, which teams can use to incorporate native code libraries into their apps using the appropriate frameworks. RS03 describes the allowed software system versions. For Android devices, there are minimum operating systems allowed. Generally, that's going to be Android version 6 or higher, depending on how new your device is. Your FTC software must be at least version 6.0 in the app version for both the driver station and robot controller. This year, your Rev Hubs also have a minimum software or firmware version, so be sure to check what's loaded onto your hubs and update them if necessary. The process for doing this can be found on the Rev Robotics website. In addition, the software that's used to load the operating system, if you use the PC Hub interface, also has a minimum version. Make sure that you update your firmware on your Rev Control and Expansion Hubs, as this contains critical fixes to improve operability of the device. Note that these rules do not require that teams upgrade to the absolute latest version of software and firmware. If this is required, a mandatory upgrade will be announced for first and communicated through the team blasts, online or on the forums. RS04 describes how your robot must transition between game modes. It's expected that your robots can operate either autonomous or driver controlled. And if you will be operating both of these modes, you must demonstrate during field inspections that your robot correctly switches between autonomous and driver controlled mode. If you do not run an autonomous during any of your matches, then you do not need to demonstrate this transition. RS05 describes the robot controller app. If you use an Android device for your robot controller, it must have the designated FTC robot controller app loaded and make it the default application for the Rev Expansion Hub. The robot controller app must not be installed on the driver station Android device, so be sure you don't have them both. The driver station app, similarly, must be installed onto your driver station Android device and be the official app used to control your robot during a match. Software version number must match the version on the robot controller, so check and ensure that they are the same. This can be done with the self-inspection device on either of the two devices. Similarly, your driver station app must not be installed on the robot controller Android device. RS07 describes the Android device and Rev Control Hub operating system settings. Your robot controller and driver station must be set to airplane mode, with the exception of Bluetooth being turned off and Wi-Fi being turned on. The Rev Control Hub password must be set different to the factory default password. Always a good idea. RS08 describes software modifications that are or are not allowed. You are not allowed to modify the driver station app in any fashion. However, you can modify the code running under the robot controller via the use of the first robot controller SDK. You are not allowed to remove, replace, or modify the portions of the SDK distributed as binary.aar files. The intention is for you to download the SDK and make modifications to add your own team code. Note that team or otherwise produced, re-engineered, reverse-engineered, or modified versions of the SDK are not allowed in competition. RS09 describes driver station communication between the robot controller and driver station. Communication must only occur between the apps run on the robot controller and driver station. Communication is limited to the unmodified mechanisms provided by the FTC software, which includes the SDK, robot controller app, and driver station app. You are not permitted to stream audio, video, or other data using third-party software or modified versions of the FTC software. You may only use the unmodified telemetry feature included with the FTC software to transfer additional data between the two devices. Software that is pre-installed by an approved phone's manufacturer and cannot be disabled is exempt from this constraint. During a match, Your robot controller and driver station are not allowed to be connected wirelessly to any devices besides each other. This is also part of the inspection process when reviewing the self-inspection checklist. Alright, so that describes all of the rules for robot inspection. In a normal tournament, inspection will be done by inspector volunteers. In a remote tournament, teams are expected to inspect themselves. For both the traditional and remote events, teams can perform self-inspection via the self-inspection checklist, which is located at the end of Game Manual 1 in Appendices B and C. Appendix B contains the robot inspection checklist, while Appendix C contains the field inspection checklist. These checklists have a convenient summary of most of the applicable rules, as well as references to the sections of the game manual where they can be found. Make sure to go over everything with your coach and your other team members before you submit your results to the official FIRST portal. This season, with the remote events, we are looking into methods of performing a remote inspection with volunteers. These inspections would consist of a virtual meeting with either like a Zoom meeting or a video call of some sort between volunteer inspectors and the teams, with the goal being to kind of walk over all the same stuff that we normally would in an inspection process, but remotely. Teams would utilize a smartphone or tablet with a camera in order to show their robot and highlight the different parts of the robot as the inspector requests. You would go over the different parts of the checklists and all of the different inspection topics in as close as possible recreation of the original inspection process. Teams in such an event should have their bill of materials, self-inspection checklist, evidence of wiring gauges, some rulers, yardsticks, tape measures, a sizing box if they have it, and any other things that they might consider bringing or finding at an inspection table at a tournament. The inspector will walk through the team through their inspection process and try and get any of their questions answered and ask the team to show them the appropriate parts of the robot as needed. We're still working out the details of this process, so we will send you any information that we end up coming to a conclusion on later in the season. In the event that the world returns to normal and we're able to host in-person traditional events, the inspection process at the tournament will be conducted by inspection volunteers, one group for robot inspection and another group for field inspection. This process will consist of the volunteer examining your robot and going down the checklist to ensure everything is in order, all the while asking team questions about the robot or software. For the robot inspection, physical size examination will take place and the sizing tool will be on hand to ensure that your robot fits within the sizing constraints. For the field inspection, a practice field will be set up for teams to set their robot on and practice running autonomous, driver-controlled, and toggling between the two. In addition, the field inspection volunteer will examine your Android device configurations to ensure that everything's up to spec. During an in-person tournament, after you've completed inspection and you're out on the playing fields, a referee may designate your robot to be re-inspected during a match, perhaps following a certain penalty. In that case, you will need to seek out inspection personnel to re-examine your robot and identify the problem and suggest solutions to solve it. You will need to pass re-inspection before you're allowed to play matches again. It is important to note that the goal of inspection is to inspect the actual mechanisms on your robot that it will use to compete in matches. Therefore, your robot must be in the configuration to be used in matches during inspections. Changing out parts after inspection is against the rules. During an in-person inspection process with a volunteer, the inspector may ask the team to test their wheels and/or treads on a sample piece of the mat to evaluate the potential for field damage. This is because not every single iteration of wheels or treads can be evaluated and posted as a legal or illegal part. So therefore, this tread test is a quick way to find out whether or not your particular wheels or treads are competition legal. This is performed by placing the robot on a field tile and against an immovable surface such as a wall, running the wheels at full power for up to 15 seconds. If any physical damage to the floor tile results, the wheels or treads will not be allowed. Discoloration or black marks alone are not considered field damage. The test must be made with the robot at the weight it will actually be using during the competition, so no lightening up your robots to pass the tread test. This concludes the summary of the Game Manual Part 1 Inspection Rules. Teams should be sure to read the entirety of both the traditional and remote event Game Manual Part 1s, as there are additional sections teams will need to know about that we did not review in this session. Thank you for watching, and good luck in the upcoming season.